speak for up to 10 minutes each. A vote could take place as early as noon Eastern to formally begin debate on a bill extending unemployment insurance benefits, which expired in December, by 3 months to March. A simple majority is needed for approval. And now to live coverage of the U.S. Senate here on C-SPAN 2.
The Senate will come to order. The chaplain, Dr. Barry Black, will lead the Senate in prayer.
Let us pray. Eternal God, creator of the universe, create hearts within our senators that will make them strong enough to know when they are weak. Give them sufficient bravery to choose the more difficult right. Lord, inspire them to be gracious in defeat and humble in victory. Give them enough integrity to face themselves when they are afraid, as they remember that perfect love destroys trepidations. Teach them, O God, how to stand up in the storm with complete confidence in the ultimate triumph of truth. We pray in your majestic name. Amen.
Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., January 9, 2014. To the Senate. Under provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Brian Schatz, a senator from the state of Hawaii, to perform the duties of the chair. Signed, Patrick J. Leahy, President Pro Tempore.
Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
Following my remarks and those of the Republican leader, will be in a period of morning business with the time until noon divided equally. The Republicans will control the first 30 minutes and will control the second 30 minutes. At noon, all post-cloture time on the motion to proceed to the unemployment insurance extension will expire, and the Senate will begin consideration of the bill. Senators will be notified when votes are scheduled. Mr. President, another day has passed, and we still have a vast majority of Republicans standing in the way of an extension of unemployment benefits. Some Republican senators are having conversations about possible offsets for a full-year extension. I've said a number of times, I think we would be ill-advised to have another short-term extension when if we're going to have an extension that they're talking about paying for it, let's do it for a year. We don't need to come back and worry about this in 3 more months. But, Mr. President, let's see how they want to pay for this. We've heard proposals. The proposals are one, to stop people from having health care. The other is to go after children and the earned income tax credit. Little American boys and girls doesn't sound like a very good idea to me. And then we have a proposal suggested by another senator late last night, that if you really look at it, it's not worth $5 billion. It's much, much less than that. To do what has been suggested by one Republican senator would be to devastate the disabled, and that wouldn't be appropriate. So I would be interested if there are other proposals. As I've indicated on a number of occasions, I continue to say offsetting the cost of emergency unemployment benefits is not something I agree with. President Bush extended emergency unemployment insurance 5 times. Not one of these 5 times was there a whimper from my Republican colleagues or certainly the Democratic senators here that it should be paid for. It wasn't right to offset the cost when Bush was president. It's not right to offset the cost now that Obama is in the White House. We've cut the deficit in half since President Obama took office, and overall debt reduction has been even more transparent, almost $3 trillion. And while we must keep up our good work, we have more to do. We must solve the nation's job crisis if we ever hope to solve fiscal problems. Today's long-term unemployment rate is more than double what it was at any time Congress let emergency job assistance expire. But since many Republican senators are insisting that the cost be offset, I'm happy to talk, as we all are on this side of the aisle, about a long-term extension of emergency unemployment benefits. I repeat, I'm waiting to hear from my Republican colleagues how to pay for this extension. It's been a week, Mr. President, since families already hanging by a thread were kicked off unemployment insurance benefits. Think about this, Mr. President. People who have been out of work for month after month after month learned at the beginning of this year they wouldn't get $300 a week. Now remember, this is not charity. It's not something that these people don't, they have, first of all, they have to lose their job through no fault of their own. And then they have to go out every week and look for a job and have to list where they will work. For every job that's available in America today, there are 3 people looking for that job. I was stunned when I had my news briefing this morning when one Republican senator said, there's so many jobs that are unfilled in America today. Let these people go get those jobs. Now try that one on for size. Mr. President, for many, the benefits were the only thing preventing them from descending into poverty or even becoming homeless. Hundreds of thousands of children, as a result of these benefits, have been stopped from going into the roles of the poor. These families can't wait any longer for relief. I'm optimistic that my Republican colleagues will help us find a way out of this, to put people first and partisanship second. But yesterday, Mr. President, House Republican leaders were forced to send, I said yesterday, it was actually Tuesday, Republican leaders were forced to send a message to their members, reminding them, these people are out of work. Be compassionate. And then, of course, the memo came over here. Can you imagine having to remind senators to be compassionate of people who have been long-term unemployed? Yesterday afternoon, Republican leaders spoke in this chamber for a long time, 45 minutes. Not once during this discussion were the words jobs, the economy, unemployment mentioned. Not once. Middle-class Americans are hurting. We know the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer, and the middle class is being squeezed. During the last 30 years, middle class has lost 10% of their earning that they had in 30 years previously, whereas the top 1% during that same 30-year period have had their income and wealth triple. These people who are struggling out there, Mr. President, are working 2 jobs. Some are even trying to do it with 3 jobs. Some of it's part-time, just in an effort to try to get by. And the rest have watched their wages shrink at the same time. As I've indicated, the richest of the rich are doing much, much better. What beleaguered Americans need is not a memo on basic human decency, as the Republicans got on Tuesday, or a bitter diatribe about the rules of the Senate. They need solutions. For 1.3 million Americans today and 5 million Americans over the course of this year, extending emergency unemployment benefits is a solution. Raising the minimum wage so mother or father working 2 jobs can afford the rent and the electric bill in the same month is a solution. Investing in job creation and education so today's workers can compete for tomorrow's jobs is a solution. And whenever my Republican colleagues are prepared to stop complaining, start working with Democrats to create solutions, we'll be right here waiting. Mr. President, before my friend, the Republican leader, makes his remarks, I would ask consent that the period for morning business be extended until 12:30 today. The senators are permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes each. Further, the Senate recess from 12:30 until 2:15. Finally, the previous order with respect to the motion to proceed S 1845 be modified so that all post-cloture time on the motion to proceed be considered expired at 2:15 rather than the earlier time I mentioned.
Without objection.
Mr. President.
Republican leader.
For months, the Democrats who run Washington have been desperate to distract from the pain of Obamacare. And now, if you listen to them, they think they've found something that might work for them. The one thing they think can actually distract folks from the misery of this law is the misery of the economic malaise that they've presided over for the last 5 years. I mean, you really have to hand it to them in one respect. It takes a lot of chutzpah to spend an entire presidential term pushing policies that are supposedly meant to help the little guy and then turn around and blame everybody else when they flop. But chutzpah won't solve the problem. And the poll-tested talking points and failed stimulus ideas we've seen Democrats trot out thus far, well, they won't do much to improve the plight of millions of Americans struggling in today's economy. To me, that's the real tragedy, because the discussion about how to help Americans who battle against the odds day after day, that's a conversation we actually should be having. In fact, it's a debate Republicans are having. In recent days, we've seen several leading Republicans talk about how to tackle poverty in the 21st century. And unlike the Democrats' outdated dates from the ideas from back in the 60s, Republicans are thinking about ways to update our nation's approach with fresh proposals that speak to the situation Americans actually find themselves in today, not back in the 60s. The Republican approach is to learn from past mistakes. It's about turning the left's good intentions into policies that can actually get the job done. And it's about moving beyond the treatment of symptoms and getting at the underlying problems. That's the thinking behind the Economic Freedom Zones Act, which Senator Paul and I recently introduced. It aims to shine a light into some of the most impoverished corners of our country, to raise up cities and families who've been left behind and sometimes literally crushed by the outdated ideas from the 60s. And to do that, to actually do that in a way that lasts. With this legislation, some of the most disadvantaged areas of our country would acquire the ability to apply for economic freedom zone status that would help lift the burden of some of the poorest families in our country. Small business owners would see fewer government regulations, enabling them to create jobs and drive prosperity. Entrepreneurs would see punitive tax barriers peel back, allowing them to lead a recovery with new ideas and new energy. Failed educational systems would see reforms that lift up disadvantaged children, giving new hope to a younger generation. Cities and regions that now face a dark future could transform themselves, if they chose, almost instantly into magnets for new ideas and for new hope. So if our Democratic colleagues are serious about their focus on economic distress, if it's more than just some poll-tested Obamacare distraction, then I would invite them to work with us on innovative new approaches like this. This could allow the Senate, for instance, to consider our proposal as an amendment to the unemployment insurance legislation currently on the floor, because this is a discussion that needs to be about really helping people. And these economic freedom zones are similar in some ways to the Promise Zone initiative recently developed by the Obama administration. I was pleased to hear that 8 counties in eastern Kentucky will soon receive Promise Zone designation. That's why I wrote in support of granting this designation last year, because there's no doubt that eastern Kentucky is a region that has suffered enormous hardship in recent years. Much of it, unfortunately, related to the very same Obama administration's war on coal families. But the Promise Zone designation is a step in the right direction nonetheless. Senator Paul and I will be heading to the White House later today for a Promise Zone event, because we're encouraged that the President is finally focused on a concrete approach to jobs that members of both parties can support, proving that we can accomplish things when we focus on real efforts rather than political show votes that are designed to fail. And Promise Zones are something we could build on with far more comprehensive approaches like Senator Paul's economic freedom zones that would reach even more communities in need of revitalization. Because let's remember this, government programs can sometimes help, but they can't do everything. And in the 1960s mindset about how to fight poverty, it needs to change to fit the realities of the 21st century. I want to share a sentiment I read just yesterday from Thomas Vinson, an unemployed coal worker from the very Kentucky county where LBJ launched his big government blitz 50 years ago. This was his take on the so-called war on poverty. What good are all these government programs if they don't get you a job? It's a feeling, the article noted, that's widespread among his neighbors in Martin County. This is why Republicans say it's time for modernization and new approaches. It's time to give folks like Thomas real hope. It's time to give them more than just good intentions.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, the Senate will be in a period of morning business until 12 noon, with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each, and with the time equally divided and controlled by the 2 leaders or their designees, with the Republicans controlling the first 30 minutes and the majority controlling the next 30 minutes.
Mr. President.
Senator from South Dakota.
Mr. President, I rise today to discuss an amendment, number 2622, that I have filed to the Solutions to Long-Term Unemployment Act that is before the Senate today. Mr. President, the bill before the Senate today would extend emergency unemployment benefits for the 13th time since 2008. Now, let me repeat that. Congress has enacted or extended emergency unemployment benefits 13 times over the past 5 years. And at some point you have to start asking yourself, Mr. President, at what point does this no longer become an emergency, but it becomes permanent? We've been doing this now for 5 years. This will be the 13th time. Obviously, there are lots of people in a tough economy who are still hurting, but what it should say to us is it's time that we started not just treating the symptom, but fixing the problem that we have in America today. And the problem that we have, Mr. President, is we've got a sluggish economy that continues to sort of stumble along. We have a chronically high unemployment rate with lots of people who have been unemployed for a very long period of time. And over that same period, Congress has pushed through Obamacare, raised taxes and job creators, while the administration has pursued aggressive regulations that have done little more than drive up costs for many of our small businesses. So after 13 extensions of unemployment benefits, expensive new regulations, and higher taxes, what's the result? Well, today, over 37% of the unemployed Americans have still been out of work for 27 weeks or longer. Now, that represents over 4 million men and women who've been most impacted by President Obama's failed economic policies. So, Mr. President, I applaud my colleagues on the Republican side of the aisle who have offered up common sense, even bipartisan, ideas to pay for the extension of emergency unemployment benefits. If we extend these benefits once again, I'm hopeful that we can find an appropriate way to pay for this extension and not pass the bill on to our children and grandchildren. However, Mr. President, I also have to come to the floor today to challenge all of my colleagues to look at solutions to the underlying problem, rather than simply treating the symptoms of long-term unemployment for yet the 13th time. The underlying problem is that we have 4 million Americans who have not been able to find work for more than 6 months on account of the stagnant Obama economy. That's almost double the amount of long-term unemployed Americans relative to pre-recession levels. So, Mr. President, my amendment addresses the underlying problem of long-term unemployment by reducing labor costs, increasing worker mobility, and strengthening federal worker training programs. First, my amendment would provide much-needed relief from Obamacare for any employer who hires an individual who's been unemployed for 27 weeks or longer. Now, as we all know, Obamacare is full of additional costs and mandates that are stifling economic growth. The Obamacare employer mandate, arguably, has the greatest impact on an already weak labor market. The impact of this mandate is so great that the administration has unilaterally delayed it until after the next election. Under this mandate, a business with 50 or more employees must provide government-approved insurance or pay an annual penalty of $2,000 to $3,000 per employee. Now, for a small or medium-sized business, that's a significant deterrent to expanding and hiring more workers. Under my amendment, if a business decides to hire someone who's been out of work for 27 weeks or longer, that person would be exempt from the Obamacare mandate for as long as he or she works at that business. Second, my amendment would further reduce labor costs by providing a 6-month payroll tax holiday for any employer who hires a long-term unemployed worker. Employers currently pay a payroll tax of 6.2% of an employee's wages up to a capped amount known as the Social Security wage base. Waiving this tax is an incentive for employers to hire those employees often considered to be a higher risk by virtue of the fact that they've been out of the labor force for an extended period of time. Now, consider a job that's paying an annual wage of $40,000. The employer payroll tax holiday in my amendment represents a $1,240 incentive for the employer to hire a long-term unemployed individual. Or take a higher skilled job paying $80,000 annually. The payroll tax holiday represents a $2,480 incentive for the employer to hire someone who's been unemployed for 27 weeks or longer. Now, when coupled with the Obamacare exemption in my amendment, that's an incentive of roughly $5,000 to hire an individual who's been unemployed for an extended period of time. Third, Mr. President, my amendment addresses a fundamental problem facing the long-term unemployed by providing relocation assistance to start a job or find better opportunities. Now, while the national labor market remains weak, there are pockets of prosperity across the country. In my home state of South Dakota, we have an unemployment rate of 3.6%. That's second only to our neighbors in North Dakota, who are fully embracing the energy renaissance, which is occurring in the upper Great Plains and other parts of the country. So, because of South Dakota's low tax and regulatory framework, it consistently makes us one of the best places in the United States to start and grow a business. In fact, one of the biggest issues we hear from prospective business investors is a concern that they're not going to have enough workers if they decide to move to my state. Now, meanwhile, you've got other parts of the nation that continue to struggle with persistently high unemployment rates. California has an unemployment rate of 8.5%. In Rhode Island, it's 9%. The number of job openings and higher rates vary from region to region as well. Now, this past summer, the rate of job openings in the South was 20% greater than in the Northeast. The same trend exists for hiring rates between those two regions. So, Mr. President, part of a dynamic 21st century economy is ensuring a mobile workforce that can meet regional demands for good-paying jobs. Now, however, if you've got someone who's been living off of unemployment benefits for the past 6 months, that person likely does not have the resources to move to a new state for a new job. What my amendment would do is provide a low-interest loan of up to $10,000 for anyone willing to relocate for a new job or move to a new state with better employment opportunities. These loans would have to be repaid within 10 years, but no payments would be required for 1 year while that individual or family gets back on their feet. Additionally, if the new job is eliminated within that first year through no fault of the employee, the loan could be forgiven. Well, finally, Mr. President, my amendment would strengthen and streamline federal worker training programs. We currently have over 50 federal training programs across 9 federal bureaucracies. It is a broken morass of programs that isn't helping employers or employees, and it certainly isn't an efficient use of taxpayer dollars. Even President Obama, in his 2012 State of the Union speech, said, and I quote, that he wanted to cut through the maze of confusing job training programs and create one program for workers to find the help that they need. Unfortunately, like many of the President's promises, that turned out to be more talk than action. So while the President has failed to put forward a real plan to reform our worker training programs, the Republican-led House of Representatives has acted on a plan to accomplish just that. The House-passed Skills Act includes several critical reforms that ensure workers receive the training that they need for positions that businesses need filled today. The Skills Act would consolidate 35 redundant and ineffective federal worker programs into a single workforce investment fund that would serve as a single source of support for workers, employers, and job seekers at the state level. This legislation creates much-needed flexibility at the state level and empowers governors and local employers to train workers for today's in-demand jobs. The Skills Act cuts through red tape and eliminates barriers that oftentimes keep workers from receiving the training they need when they need it. For too long, we have been throwing taxpayer dollars at a maze of overlapping bureaucracies when we should be providing more targeted assistance directly to job seekers. We need to be training our workers for the high-tech jobs of today and the jobs that will continue to be in demand in the future. The Skills Act accomplishes these goals, which is why I included it in my amendment as a common-sense way to help the long-term unemployed trying to find work in today's economy. Mr. President, there's no one solution to helping the unemployed. However, one thing is clear. We need to find ways to make it more attractive for employers to invest and hire workers rather than constantly pushing legislation that will raise the cost of doing business in America. Now let's think for just a second about the bills the Democrat majority supports or supported in the past. Obamacare raised the cost of labor. It drove up premiums for millions of Americans, and it made it more expensive for employers to hire new employees. Raising the minimum wage will raise the cost of hiring new employees and only worsen the job prospects for the long-term unemployed. The tax increases pushed by Democrats here in the Senate and the White House apply to millions of small business owners, which discourages investment and job growth. New environmental regulations are driving up the cost of energy and therefore the cost of doing business in this country. So, Mr. President, I'm not suggesting that the provisions in my amendment are the only way to make it more economical for employers to hire more workers. But I am suggesting that if we want more employment, we need to make it less costly, not more costly, to hire each additional employee. And it seems that nearly every policy pursued by the Democratic majority in the White House would raise costs on businesses, especially those small businesses which create the majority of jobs in this country. Mr. President, we've tried the approach of bigger government, higher taxes, and more regulations for the last 5 years, and it has not worked. Let's try something different. Let's have a real debate about how we lower costs and make it easier for employers to go out and hire new employees. Mr. President, let's focus our efforts on those who need the most help, such as those Americans who've been out of work the longest on account of the lagging Obama economy. Mr. President, I hope that this amendment, as well as others that my colleagues will offer, have an opportunity to be heard here on the floor of the United States Senate and voted on. You know, what we have going on here now in terms of a process doesn't resemble anything like an open process that should allow us to openly debate the big issues that affect the American people. And this is a pocketbook issue. This strikes at the very heart of the quality of life, the standard of living, the future economic well-being of Americans all across this country. And I hope, certainly hope, that the majority leader will allow for an open process that will enable us to enter into that debate, to put forward proposals, mine among many others, that could be considered here and voted on, that would actually improve the overall situation of middle-class Americans. It is high time we had that debate. I hope we can, and I hope the majority will give us that opportunity. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President. The Senator from Georgia. Mr. President, before I make my remarks, I want to commend the Senator from South Dakota and underscore what the Senator said regarding the Skills Act passed by the House of Representatives. I'm the ranking member of the Labor Subcommittee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions. 6 years ago, the Workforce Investment Act expired in its authorization, and for 6 years it has languished in the bowels and in the heart of the United States Senate and the United States House of Representatives, going unauthorized. During that same 6-year period of time between 2008 and today, America's experienced terrible unemployment, terrible job loss, terrible increases in unemployment, and extensions of that unemployment. The gentleman from South Carolina is exactly correct. If we were doing our job and just reauthorizing the programs that are in the law today, like the Workforce Investment Act, and training people for the skills of the 21st century and the jobs of the 21st century, we wouldn't be talking about unemployment compensation. We wouldn't be talking about the great tragedies of America. We'd be talking about America's greatest prosperity. So I want to commend the Senator from South Dakota for pointing out what is critically important for us to recognize as members of the United States Senate and the United States Congress. I come to the floor, though, to talk about the Affordable Care Act. I want to tell a couple of real-life stories that came to me via email, but before I do, my job, as in the President's job, is to do what the people of Georgia want me to do. And I have office hours when I'm home. I answer my own phone calls. I try and respond to the concerns I have. I try and see that people get referred to the right place. Since January 1, I've dealt with almost nothing but the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, and the consequences of that act and what effect it's really having on the American people and the people of Georgia. And in particular on the two great promises that were used on the floor of this Senate to sell that legislation to the American people. One, if you like your policy, you can keep it. And if you like your doctor, you can keep him or her. Both those were clear promises, unequivocal promises. I want to tell you two stories today that came to my attention that illustrate how that was incorrect and not true, and these are just two of many, many stories. The first is from Jane. Jane writes, Senator, this is not my story, but it's a friend's story. His name is Steve. He suffered with multiple myeloma for more than 10 years. That is a disease that usually kills within 5. But because of having excellent health care, he's been able to survive through his health care plan. Now he's been told, through his health care plan with the Mayo Clinic, and has been supplied with a myriad of drugs that have kept him alive. Now he's been told the plan will be canceled since the plan does not meet the minimum standards of the ACA. Now that he no longer continue his treatments because the various plans that have deemed the drugs he needs to stay alive have been determined as experimental. Wow. Really, is that just awful? It's not enough being said about this government to take over our lives and affecting our health care. And what about the promise that was made if we liked our plan, we could keep it? Steve doesn't have a plan, but he still has multiple myeloma. And this story that comes about the promise of if you like your doctor, you can keep it. This is from Felicia in Alpharetta, Georgia, a story I hear more and more as I travel my state. My husband and I are currently paying individual health care policies as he currently has a small business and I used to own one myself. He's on Kaiser, HMO, and I'm on a PPO with Blue Cross Blue Shield. We've received numerous letters with conflicting information regarding changes to our policies. We are reasonably intelligent people, and yet we cannot figure out what is exactly happening with our health care, nor do we believe the government has any clue what is happening with this new legislation. Also, in comparing an equivalent Obamacare policy to my current policy, I have only 10% of the doctors available in network to what I had before, and my doctors that I now use are not in the network. Please stop and repeal this ridiculous legislation. I do not see any evidence that the government can improve my health care or the health care of the American people, or any evidence that it has caused anything other than confusion, created wasted time, wasted money, and driven Americans crazy. Now, these are 2 emails that were sent to me out of many more that I could be writing. But one of the important things for us to understand is the impact of the Affordable Care Act is having a tremendous impact on the American people and the people of my state. In fact, I'll tell you my experiences personally, just over the Christmas holidays. In December, I enrolled through the D.C. health care plan to buy my health care plan because all of Congress was moved into the D.C. health exchange to comply with the Obamacare legislation. I worked hard to see to it that I could try and match the same care I had had before under Plan 105 Blue Cross Blue Shield under the government health care plan. I couldn't find exactly a good enough match of PPO, but I came close. Close in everything except premium. The premium went up 20%. And I think most of the American people, certainly people of my age, are realizing the same type of experience, where premiums are going up and up. And I would suspect the reason why the executive order to extend next year's open enrollment date beyond the election was in part because I think the administration suspects what I suspect, and that is the realities of less enrollment than we thought we'd have, fewer young people going into coverage than we thought we'd have is going to mean higher premiums, less access, and less affordability. But let me tell you another story that really is poignant and to me kind of broke my heart. Unfortunately, I was able to help with, but when I found out about it, it did break my heart. It's a story about my grandson Jack and his speech therapist. Jack's a great kid, a highly intelligent kid, but had some speech problems and so had a special speech therapist named Dr. Tim. Over the Christmas holidays, I got to meet Dr. Tim, and we were talking about his job, what he does as a speech therapist, and about Jack and all of his improvement. And Dr. Tim's turned to me and he said, you know, I don't want to burden you with my personal problem, but my youngest daughter has cystic fibrosis and has had it into her teenage years. And I've had health care coverage up until a week ago when I was notified my health coverage would no longer pay for the drugs it takes to keep her alive. Now, for anybody in this Senate or anybody in America who understands cystic fibrosis, it is a terrible, debilitating disease of the lung that used to people never lived to the age of 21. But because of medicine, because of health care, and because of breakthroughs in pharmaceutical therapy, people live past the age of 21. In fact, we have a Georgian who lived into his 50s before he passed from cystic fibrosis. But they cannot live if they don't have the pharmaceutical therapy, and there are no substitutes and there are no replacements. This gentleman, this doctor, lost his health care reimbursement for pharmaceuticals for cystic fibrosis, in part because of the judgments and the applicability of the Affordable Care Act. Now, to his credit, and to the credit of the health care system and the insurance industry, he was able to in part replace it, but not nearly as close as what he had on the policy before. These are just little stories about Americans who are experiencing terrible problems because of the change in our health care system. The promises we made are not being kept. The promises that were made to sell the Affordable Care Act to the American people and to the Congress of the United States just are not being kept. It is important for us to understand that cannot stand. And if what happens next year happens, as I think it will, costs will skyrocket again to the American people, access and affordability will go away or will not be near as good as it is, and we will have taken a health care system that was the envy of the world and turned it into a health care system that's the biggest problem in the world. Mr. President, I want things to work. I want to help the American people. I want them to have access to affordable health care. I want them to have access to their doctor. I want them to be able to keep their policy. And we need to work towards that as we go through the tragedies of the implementation in 2014 of the Health Care Act and the Obamacare Act, which today is America's #1 personal problem for the average American citizen. Mr. President, I'm grateful for the time, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. President.
Senator from Indiana.
Mr. President, I come here to talk about a couple of items. Apparently, we're sort of in a now second-day delay as the Majority Leader and his caucus decide whether or not Republicans will be allowed to offer alternatives, to offer amendments to the proposal that is before us, and that is the extension of the Unemployment Insurance Act. I was one of 6 who voted for the motion to proceed for the very purpose of achieving the opportunity to offer ideas that I have had and to allow others on our side of the aisle to offer their ideas as to how we can improve this program and how we ought to address it at this point in our continuing effort to struggle out of the Great Recession, now into its fifth year. Unemployment is still high in my state, over 7%, as a number of states. That's unacceptable. And particularly in the fifth year after a recession, the growth has been so anemic and so tepid that we're just sort of staggering our way into a better position. Nevertheless, while some people are finding jobs and getting back to work, there are many that aren't. And that is a serious subject, and that's something that we ought to be debating and talking about. Unemployment insurance is one of the programs which has been proposed to help those in need, and there are people that are genuinely in need of that help and who have made every possible effort to get back to work, and for many reasons have not been able to do so. But we also know, and it's been documented, that there are many people that have taken advantage of this program and basically said, I don't have to work hard to get back to work because I'm getting enough support from the government. And we have to acknowledge the fact that there are issues that have to be policy issues that have to be discussed as we go forward without just automatically extending a program where we know reforms would make the program better and would put us in a better position to help people get back to work and to move our economy. And we also know that working now to just pass a budget for the first time here in several years to work off of, that the number that we agreed on that we wouldn't go over is now being violated. The very first legislative piece that has come before this body violates the budget agreement that was agreed to just a short time ago. And so a number of us would like the opportunity to propose ways to offset the spending if this program goes forward. So the combination of those two things, reforms that will allow for us to continue to support those who are genuinely unable to find work, from those who are taking advantage of the program and abuse of the program, as well as suggestions as to how we can support efforts toward more full employment through training programs, through any number of initiatives that my colleagues would like to at least talk about, at least debate, and at least have the vote on. We're not sure we're in the minority here. We're not sure we're going to win any of those votes, although I think if we make persuasive enough arguments and it makes enough sense, perhaps we will. Given this two-day delay in terms of a decision from the Majority Leader, Harry Reid, as to whether or not to allow us these opportunities, it appears that we have, through this tactic of supporting the motion to proceed, literally put the ball in Harry Reid's office, in his court, in his caucus court, as to what they want to do. We went through the year 2013, and since July, Republicans have been offered only 4 amendments total for all the things done in the last 6 months of this year. That is not how the Senate works or is supposed to work. That is a dictatorial dictate by the Majority Leader that is unprecedented in 200 years of operation or more of operation of this United States Senate. But I also want to comment, and so we're waiting for that decision, and obviously that decision will have a bearing on my position on this particular issue. I would also, though, like to comment on the fact that lately we've been hearing a lot from the President about income inequality. And I anticipate we'll be hearing a lot more as we move toward the 2014 elections in November. There will be a debate on this, and I hope there will be a debate that allows both sides to look at this in a serious way and try to find ways to address the issue. But if we do that, I think it's important that we understand that the President's signature accomplishment, the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare as it is called, is contributing to the problem of income inequality. So any debate on that issue, which, as I said, we'll likely hear much more of as we approach the November election, any debate on that, to be factually accurate and to be truthful, needs to incorporate a conversation about the impact of Obamacare. As recently as 2012, we were told by the President that the health insurance premiums paid by small businesses and individuals, quote, will go down. And yet, even as the administration recently has admitted that many Americans will pay more for health care because of the Obama law, this week, in the latest report on health spending trends from CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid, disclosed that health care spending in the United States rose 3.7% in 2012. That is less than what it arose in previous years, and that's a good sign. Now, too many are saying, well, the reason for this is the Affordable Care Act. Had we not passed the Affordable Care Act, this wouldn't have happened. Apparently, though, they didn't read the rest of the report, because the report also states that the provisions in the Affordable Care Act had minimal impact on total national health spending. So while the administration may claim that their bill, the Obamacare, is lowering overall health spending, the report says it has only had a minimal impact. What's happening is that there are reforms being made through the private sector, through the providers, in terms of more efficient, more effective ways to deliver health care. That's not operating because of the Health Care Act, and in fact, Health Care Act, if we're truthful about it, is contributing to the problem of inequality. Many Americans are experiencing, despite what the President has said, higher premiums or paying outrageous deductibles when they purchase coverage through the Obamacare exchanges. Now let's bring this down to a personal level, because I've been receiving hundreds, actually thousands, of emails, phone calls, letters, comments that I hear back home from Hoosiers who basically said, this ain't working, and it's sure not working for me. But I want to bring it down to the personal level so we can understand what individuals and families are going through at this particular time with this mandate imposed upon them relative to their health care coverage. Thomas from Indianapolis wrote to me and said that he went on the Obamacare exchange to take a look at health insurance plans that would be available to him. And he was, as he said, and I quote, shocked to find that it was at least $200 a month, that's $2,400 a year, more than he had been quoted just a few months before from a broker. So he went to an insurance broker who said, well, under the Affordable Care Act, you will pay this. And then a couple of months later, because he was deciding whether or not he could afford that, he went back on the exchange and said, this is going to cost you $2,400 more than just it would have a couple of months ago. He added, and I quote, I have thought about just going without insurance, as we know many individuals are thinking about and have decided not to sign up for this program. And of course the program is built financially on the fact that millions will sign up. And that's not happening, and I predict that's going to break the program, break the back of the program. And it's not just my prediction, it's those analysts and insurance companies and others who have studied actuarially what's happening here. So he added that, I thought about going without insurance, but my family suggested that I shouldn't do that. So the Affordable Care Act has created a terrible quandary for me, he said. At this point, I feel as if the federal government is like a mean big brother making my life miserable. William from Granger, Indiana, emailed to tell me that his wife, who works as a part-time nurse, now no longer is offered health care because she is part-time. And the law specifies that if you work under a certain amount of hours, the employer does not have to provide insurance, and that's exactly what the employer has done. So William then decided, well, okay, I'll have to go into the exchange and find insurance for my wife and my family, and discovered that their premiums will rise to $19,076 a year. He goes on to say, so much for if you like your plan, if you like your doctor, your costs will go down by $2,500. Let me repeat that. The President has said, your costs are going to go down by an average of $2,500 a year. Williams' costs increase over $7,500 a year. That's a $10,000 swing. That was not what was promised. Randy from Cambridge City, Indiana, told me I've been offered insurance through work at a cost of $318 or $80 a week. I then checked healthcare.gov, Affordable Care Act, and been given a quote of $450 a month. I work a minimum wage job and work as many hours as I can to get by as it is. After taxes and child support, which I have to pay in order to child support in order to work, neither option is an option that I can afford. I also can't even afford to pay the penalty payment. These are just a few of the hundreds, if not thousands, of Hoosier comments that I have heard from people who are experiencing sticker shock when they search for a so-called affordable plan under Obamacare. I don't know if these people are Republicans, are Democrats, conservatives, moderates, liberals, non-voters, voters. These are just human beings that live in my state, regardless of their political affiliation, are basically saying this thing is killing us. And all these examples, multiplied by hundreds if not thousands, are contributing to the inequality that the President is talking about. The inescapable truth is that the Democrats forced an unwanted, unpopular, and unread, famous quote from then House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, got to pass the bill so we can find out about it, what's in it, and we're finding out about what's in it. An unwanted, unpopular, and unread 2,000-plus page, one-size-fits-all health care dictated by one party without any support, without any contribution allowed by the minority, questioning whether this is the best way to deal with health care issues. Jamming this thing through on Christmas Eve Day, 2009, it's turned out to be a disastrous Christmas gift for the American people. Families across our country are being forced to redirect money they would have used to pay rent, to help their children attend school, to put food on the table, to pay the electric bills, and finding that many can't even do that. So, as we discuss the issue of income equality, and it appears that the President is going to want to do that throughout this coming election year, let's not pretend that Obamacare is helping the situation. It's not. And we need to face up to the fact that the Affordable Care Act, boy, I'll bet the writers of this bill wish, if they could do it over again, wish they had not used the word affordable. They could call it the Health Care Act or Health Care Act for American People or whatever. If they went back and rewrote it, I'll bet you they'd drop the word affordable based on the facts, not the perception, the facts as to what this health care bill is. And I suspect that they would have wanted to pass this in a bipartisan way so that at this particular point in time they wouldn't have to take full responsibility for this act. Too many hardworking American families are paying more, not less, for health care because of Obamacare, and it is contributing to the inequality that the President continues to talk about. Mr. President, with that, I yield the floor.
Of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.